The Art of Being Ruled. Wyndham Lewis. Original publication 1926. 1989 edition. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 3. The Small Man. Chapter 3. No End of the World in Social Revolution. Having done me best to remove the kind of general verbal misunderstanding where the sensational word revolution is concerned, I can very briefly offer an interpretation of the great cluster of movements disrupting our time. The first thing to notice about it is its implacableness, inasmuch as no local success will satisfy it. It is not any personality, nation, or even particular ruling class that is aimed at, but an entire human revaluation. That is, of course, why it is more like a religion than a rebellion. It is as though a mind had placed itself over against the world and formed the resolve to reconstitute the human idea itself. It is the whole of humanity this time that is at stake. The philosopher's dissatisfaction with the human animal expresses itself at the heart of this disturbance, rather even than the outraged prophet's disgust at the way men treat each other. The oppression of the poor by the rich is associated with the stultification of the great by the small. The stupid rich is the enemy, and, strange as that might sound, it is the small who are the real villains of the piece. It is much more the senseless competition of a false independence, the chaos of a multitude of ineffective, pretentious, and discordant wills, that it is sought to reduce to order, than the overthrow of this ephemeral plutocracy or that. That this fanatical and grandiose conception is not necessarily tucked away inside the head of any subordinate official of this vast change, or shared even by all its promoters, is no doubt true. But nothing short of such a conception can adequately account for its scope, implacability, and power. At least one am unable to imagine any other. We are in the presence, I think, of a religious rather than a political intelligence, or rather, as in all primitive societies these two things are one, in the presence of an unspoilt and primitive source whose will is so great that it clothes itself naturally in the form of a god. That any such movement must float itself at first on some great emotional tide is plain. And it is inevitable that it should take a class form rather than a national form. The nation as a unit is not universal enough for its purposes, only the class is general enough, and the subject or slave class bulky enough, both helpless and immense, pathetic enough, and primitive enough, to answer to its requirements. It is really an idea in the sense that we have seen Fouillé interpreting a certain class of ideas for us, that is, a forcible emotion wrapped up in an ideologic covering, fixed and, as it were, embalmed in the intellect. It is in the exactest sense idealistic. As such its natural enemy is the great group of emotions of a natural order, the filial and family emotions. All the organizations and habits that attach people to life in its ordinary sense, those of the state and family notably, stand between it and its realization. Saint Columba was the saint of a similar religious upheaval for affronting and overcoming these deepest human affections in favor of the greatest abstract love of God. How near in many ways primitive Christianity was to the present revolution has often been pointed out. It claimed of the convert the same fanatical allegiance, was international in the same way, and hostile to organized social life. Sir Samuel Dill, in speaking of the contemporary objections to evangelical Christianity on this score, writes, "And there is some of the religious literature of that period which gives a color to part of this indictment. In the very years when the great invasions were desolating the provinces of the West, and when the hosts of Radagaisus and Alaric were threatening the heart of the empire, S. Paulinus wrote a remarkable letter to a soldier who felt himself drawn to the higher Christian life. In this epistle the ascetic ideal is expounded with a breadth and absence of qualification which shock and amaze the modern reader. The evangelical counsels of perfection are construed in the sternest and most uncompromising fashion. Christian obedience is boldly represented as inconsistent with the duties of citizenship and the relations of family life. The love of father or mother, of wife or child, the desire for riches or honor, devotion to one's country, are all so many barriers to keep the soul from Christ. There is not a word to indicate that a Christian life, worthy of the name, could be made compatible with the performance of worldly duties. The rich are condemned forever, in the words of prophet or evangelist. The soldier is a mere shedder of blood, doomed to eternal torment. There is no possibility of serving both Christ and Caesar. This was the way in which secular life was regarded by the voluntary exiles who followed St. Jerome. Such a movement might well seem to an old-fashioned Roman as a renunciation, not only of citizenship, but of all the hard-won fruits of civilization and social life. If this was the highest form of Christian life, as its devotees proclaimed it to be, then Christianity was the foe, not only of the old religion, but of the social and political order which Rome had given to the world. It is hardly to be wondered at that the monks were execrated alike by the mob and by the cultivated pagan noble. Last century of the Western Empire. The ways in which these two movements differ from each other is as easy to see as their points of comparison. The heavenly kingdom was not essentially different to the promise of proletarian participation in a higher terrestrial life, because the world was to be destroyed almost at once prior to its establishment, and its rewards and benefits were very concrete. Today, however, the promises on this plane are realizable. There is no necessity to postulate the suppression of the world for its advent, for the goods are there to hand over. People can manufacture their own heaven. The All-Father or Father Christmas is science. But the plan does not end with this animal bounty and static salvation. The Christian otherworldliness was far more worldly and limited than the present objective. The Christian heaven is thrown in here, as it were, as a practical inducement to allow at last the freeing of the human mind for tasks of a higher order. It is both more positive and more aristocratic, to use that convenient term to discriminate it from the usurpation of Christian altruism. That is its great and valuable difference.